it's a great honor to introduce a great thinker like Amartya Sen. It's also a bit overwhelming because he has written so many books. I brought a few of them, but he has written many more, and even many more articles. Amartya Sen is, to many of us, a greatly admired economist, a philosopher, and also a writer. He has always been engaged, as Karen was saying, with the poorest of the poor and the people who are the most marginalized. Amartya Sen has published over 26 books, numerous articles. His work has been translated in over 30 languages, and Time magazine says he's one of the 50 most influential thinkers. Amartya Sen is an intellectual with many nicknames. So let me mention a few of them to you. What to think of the conscience of economists, or the Mother Teresa of development economics, to the argumentative Indian. Yeah? All these nicknames have relevance to some aspect of his work. And today I'm going to guide you through all of that he has written. Well, not all, but the main themes. I've made the following characterization of his work. I distinguish between 5 main themes. These themes represent his work more or less in chronological order. I say more or less because theme 1 and theme 2 could be swapped around. But I think I feel I need to warm up a little bit. And I will start with poverty and famines first. It could also be the second theme. Because I feel I also need to warm up you a little bit and warm up your brains before we can delve into the topic of welfare economics. And if someone can maybe watch the door, because I hear people still coming in and I don't know why it closes. Great, thank you. Needless to say, these 5 categorizations are my categorizations. Someone else might choose different categorizations for good reasons. But before we go to discuss these 5 main themes, let me take you for a while through his timeline. He describes his own life as a life that was spent pretty much in university grounds. And he was indeed also born in a university ground, or a college ground at least. Amartya Sen was born in 1933 in West Bengal in the grounds of a college. This was the Visva-Bharata school of Rabindranath Tagore. And Rabindranath Tagore was a very influential thinker in the same time as Gandhi was. And he was, in fact, the first Indian who ever won a Nobel Prize. He won the Nobel Prize in literature. And in this school of Rabindranath Tagore, Sen learned a lot about the reason, the public reason and the value of plurality, of global inclusivity, of multiculturalism. And these were quite, this was quite an open-minded school to go to in those days. His father was a teacher, a professor in chemistry in Dhaka, and that is where they spent the early years. After the partition from India, they moved to India, and there Amartya enrolled in the school in Visva-Bharata. In 1951, he started his first university education doing a bachelor in economics at Presidency College in Calcutta. And there he also did a minor in mathematics. And we'll see a lot of mathematics coming back into his work also today. In 1953, he started a second bachelor, again in economics, and after that a master's and also a PhD, but this time in England. He moved to Trinity College in Cambridge. Whilst he was still completing his PhD, he already was accepted for a professorship at the newly founded Yadavpur University in Calcutta, and he moved back to India again. And when he finally submitted his PhD in 1959, he also won a prize, a fellowship at Trinity College in Cambridge, and he used this prize to study 4 years of philosophy. In 1961, he became a professor in economics and the head of the economics department at the prestigious Delhi School in India. And there he stayed until 1972, when he became a professor in economics at the London School of Economics in the UK again. He moved on to the Drummond Professorship in Political Economy at Oxford in the UK in 1980. And after that, he became a professor at Harvard University in the USA. So then he moved to the US. In 1998, this was the year that he also won the Nobel Prize in economics. He moved back to Cambridge and he became the master of Trinity College and a professor still. And until 2004, he stayed there, and then he moved to Harvard again in 2004, and this is where he still is today, in the philosophy department, teaching economics and philosophy. I should say that during his time at Cambridge, he met famous scholars such as Joan Robinson, and in Harvard, he had the opportunity to work with Kenneth Arrow and also with John Rawls. And I will come to talk about them more later on in my lecture. But let's first talk about the first major theme that runs through his work, poverty and famines. In 1943, Sen lived through a major historical event in his country, and this was the Bengal famine. Although Sen's family was never affected, there were many people around him that died because of hunger. It was a major historical event, and Sen has studied the Bengal famine together with a number of other famines, and I want to tell you more about it. First of all, in the Bengal famine, 3 million people died, and the famine lasted only 1 year, so you can imagine how devastating this event was. People also call it the man-made Holocaust. Yeah? It was in 1943, the time of the Second World War, and instead of arguing that the cause of this famine was an absolute production shortage of food, Sen found out that, in fact, it was a complex set of reasons that caused this famine. It was at the time of the World War II. The Japanese had occupied neighboring Burma, and Burma exported always a lot of rice to India, and that suddenly stopped. There were many, because also of the war, there were many communication disruptions in the country. So communication was very bad and transportation was difficult. And you can imagine how that has affected the situation. A third factor was that there were many crop failures. There was an epidemic disease, and there were floods. So a lot of crops, food crops, were destroyed. A fourth reason was that the government failed to redistribute food throughout the country because of communication and transportation failure, but also because of governance failure. And fifth, the rich in the country started to buy a lot of food and to start to hoard it. So this drove up prices in the country. As a result of that, food that was there became unavailable to large segments of the population, especially to the landless laborers. They did not have an opportunity to buy the food because they had no income. They couldn't grow the food themselves because they had no land. And they failed to exercise their citizens' rights to access food in another way, for example, through food handouts. In short, there was a huge entitlement failure. And it is this notion of entitlement that became very important in Sen's work. It is the first concept I'm going to introduce to you. So his finding was, from analyzing the Bengal famine and the other subsequent famines, that instead of ascribing hunger and the scaling up of hunger to a famine to food production shortages only, Sen argued that the famine was caused by an entitlement failure. And an entitlement Sen defines as the set of alternative commodities that a person can command in a society using the totality of rights and opportunities that he or she has. For example, the opportunity to buy food with income earned, the opportunity to produce food on your own land, or the right to food handouts. Now, in the occasion that all these entitlements fail, a person that goes hunger can upscale to a famine quite quickly. And this is what happened during the Bengal famine. Because people's entitlements were failing, Sen also described the notion of capability in relation to famine. Let me go back for one moment. He described how people were incapable to do all of these things. And this notion of capability that he introduced already earlier in his work. In his book of 1970, the title of this book was Collective Choice and Social Welfare. The theme of social welfare became a red line through his work. His interest in welfare, and I will come to the capability topic later, were two questions. The first question is, how are resources distributed in society? And two, how do we make decisions together on this resource distribution in a way that leads to an optimal distribution, but also to a distribution that is fair or just. Okay? Now, from public policy and social choice theory, one can distinguish between concerns about total welfare of a society. One can also distinguish a concern for the welfare of the poorest. And this is always what Sen's concern has been, the welfare of the poorest. How come this person is not able to buy food? How come this person cannot exercise his or her entitlement right to food? And this was, this is a key red line in his work. Amartya Sen was greatly influenced during his own economic studies and early teaching by two great thinkers himself in those days, Kenneth Arrow and John Rawls. With Kenneth Arrow, he agreed that it was quite impossible to find an optimal social solution to a distributional problem if we try to get there via maximizing individual welfare functions. And I will give you an example of that in a minute. From John Rawls, with John Rawls, he agreed that we need some understanding of ethics and morale to evaluate why a certain social outcome is just or fair. And Sen used his knowledge from mathematics, economics, but also from philosophy to approach this difficult issue of how to decide on social welfare collectively. In his 1970 book, he developed the key argument that social choices can be made on the basis of what we call partial orderings instead of complete orderings, and with use of reason. Now, this is quite a technical point, so let me try to illustrate it with an example. And this is based on a parable, a short story, from one of his books, The Idea of Justice, 2009, where he writes about 3 children who have a flute, one flute, and the point is, who is entitled to own this flute? For example, there is Anne. She can play the flute, and she believes this is the most important reason to be entitled to this flute. It is actually more important than Bob's reason. Bob is very poor. He cannot obtain the flute in any other way, so he claims he is entitled to the flute. But Anne thinks her reason is more important. Bob believes he is entitled to the flute above anyone else. And Carla, she thinks she's entitled to the flute because she has made the flute. And she's entitled to the fruits of her own labor. Now, these are 3 valid arguments. One is not necessarily better than the other. Given that these 3 children have exactly different orderings, different complete orderings over the different possibilities, we cannot simply add them up because it wouldn't give you a social optimal outcome. There's always someone who will be worse off, for example. So, what to do in this case? We need reason. We need these 3 children to debate with each other and agree on a collective choice rule. For example, together they could decide, for example, that Bob, the poorest, should have the flute, and that this outcome, this social outcome, is preferable over the other 2. Whether then Anne's option is more preferable over Carla's option or Carla over Anne, that doesn't really matter. As long as they agree on this outcome, we can have a collective decision. But clearly, reason is needed to reach to such a social choice together. Here we see Sen departing with classical social theory and also with welfare economics. And instead, he's introducing his own theory. And this is the capability choice theory, which he wrote about in 1982. And being an economist, his unit of analysis was the individual economic agent and what he or she is capable of doing. Why is it that Bob was too poor to buy the flute? Why is it that Bob had not developed the capabilities to make a flute or obtain resources to ask someone else to make the flute? He needed, for answering these questions, he needed a second key concept, or a third a third one. I've mentioned entitlement, capability, and now functionings, a third concept. Functionings, functionings are valuable achievements of a person. What he or she manages to do with her or his capabilities given the resources available. For example, to have a bike is clearly different from being able to ride a bike. Well, maybe not for Dutch people, but for other people it may be something entirely different. Clearly, to be able to ride a bike, one needs to be capable of riding a bike. Otherwise, having a bike is something different from being able to ride it. Mathematically, this theory looks as follows. Let me get my notes. Sen defines the concept of freedom as the choice of functionings. And let me explain what he means by that. Sen defines freedom as people's choice of functionings. Freedoms defined as a choice of functionings. I see that the top of my slide is not on the screen, unfortunately. Can that be adjusted? The title is not there. Okay, well, I hope it can. It says, in any case, the title is Freedom is Choice of Functionings. Let us assume that an individual person, I, denoted by the letter I in these equations, has access to a resource or commodity X, which is on the right-hand side, the commodity vector. I will talk about she from here on. She converts this commodity, for example, a bike, by means of a converting function c, the small letter c, into a set of characteristics of this commodity. The bike becomes a means of transportation. The function f, fi, is then an individual function which denotes the personal utilization function, reflecting one pattern of use of the commodity, of the bike. The achieved functioning by person I is then denoted by the function b. B is the achieved function. I can use the bike for riding. There are alternative uses of a bike. I could also use it as a status symbol. I could use it maybe as a sports item. Yeah? But let's say I use the bike to ride it and use it as a transportation mean. The achieved function is denoted by B. The valuation that a person attached to that achieved functioning is denoted by V. For a given commodity X, all the functionings possible for a person I are given by P. P is the total set of possible functionings of this bike, for example. As I said, the bike can be a transportation mean. It can also have other functions. Not all functions may be open, may be available to me. Think about a woman in a rural area in Uganda that may not be allowed to ride the bike. She may be capable of doing it, but maybe her culture forbids her to ride the bike. She could still use the bike as a status symbol, but she cannot maybe ride it and use it as a transportation mean. If the person choice of commodity factor is restricted to a subset, which is always denoted by capital, here the capital X, then the person's feasible functionings are given by the set Q. Conclusion: all these variables in these equations can vary from one person to the other because of interpersonal differences in capability, but also because of inequality. Yeah? So think about it. All these characters can vary between you, between me. Of course, in a society that is fairly equal, our functionings may not be that different, apart from our innate capabilities or the professions that we choose. But in a highly unequal society, one can imagine that there are a lot of variations, a lot of differences.
May I ask a question?
Could you perhaps wait? Yeah, thank you. If you can hold on to your question, that would be great. If you take out this lesson from this lecture, I would be very happy. It is all about the issue of inequality. In his 1970 book, Sen goes on then to investigate what causes these inequalities between people. He looks at inequality based on what he knows about inequality in India, but also in other societies. And he finds that unequal opportunities may prevent people to use their capabilities well. Unequal access to education and training may also hinder people's capability development. And because of inequality, more broadly, people may not have many alternatives to choose from. So this limits the set of possible functionings one can achieve. And this is why Sen defines in his early books freedom as the choice of functionings. Yeah? And he explained it mathematically. But we can also explain it in the words of Malala. Like Malala, there were and still are many girls in India who do not have an opportunity to go to school and to develop their capabilities to the full potential. After these two major achievements, his writings on poverty and famine, and also his contributions to welfare economics in terms of a new theory, the capability approach, Sen received the Nobel Prize in economics in 1998. And this brings me to my third theme. It's a different topic, maybe not so related, you might say, at first sight to economics, but it is. It is the theme of identity and violence. And especially in his more recent books, this theme is always there. And I think now it's time to listen to Amartya Sen himself for a few minutes. I've chosen an excerpt from a YouTube video when he's reading part of his book. It is the book Identity and Violence, this one. I remember when I first listened to Amartya Sen, I had sometimes difficulties understanding him. Not so much because of the accent, but because I think his speech was affected by his cancer. He developed cancer in the mouth when he was a young man, and he was operated and cured. But I think ever after his speech was affected by it. So therefore, I also printed what he says on the slides. But let's listen to him for a while. Maybe we can turn up the volume a bit.
But I'm commanded to do that. Yes, I do that. Yes, good boy. Read. Yeah. chapter called Making Sense of Identity. History and background are not the only way of seeing ourselves and the groups to which we belong. There are a great variety of categories to which we simultaneously belong. I can be at the same time, and I've said this all biographically a bit, same time an Asian, an Indian citizen, a Bengali with Bangladeshi ancestry, a British resident, an economist, a dabbler in philosophy, an author, a Sanskritist, a strong believer in secularism and democracy, a man, a feminist, a heterosexual, a defender of gay and lesbian rights, with a non-religious lifestyle from a Hindu background, a non-Brahmin, and a non-believer in an afterlife, and also, in case the question is asked, a non-believer in before life as well. This is just a small sample of diverse categories, to each of which I may simultaneously belong. There are, of course, a great many other membership categories too, which, depending on circumstances, can move and engage me.
Sen introduces here the notion of plural identity. He argues, based on his own example, he argues how people have plural identity. People are more than just their background, just their religion, just their gender, just the color of their skin, just their profession. And of course, people give priority to these identities according to context and according to own judgments. For example, right now I like to give priority to me being an academic. But at home I might want to give priority to being a family member. And sometimes, on rare occasions, I can combine these two and invite one of my daughters here and have two priorities met in one, and maybe something more. The thing is that reason and choice are needed to know which priorities are relevant to you, but also to be able to weigh these priorities differently according to context. Before people choose to prioritize, reason is needed. And freedom, Sen argues, is then about being able to choose one's identity freely. He warns us for the trap of singular identity. Conflict can easily arise if we perceive each other very narrowly in terms of just a single identity. Also, if we do not grant people the freedom to choose their own identity, intolerance is around the corner. But people are in a nasty habit of ascribing certain characteristics to other people based on singular identities. All Christians are corrupt. All Muslims are intolerant. There's great danger in people accepting conformist behavior uncritically. It leads to choice without reason. Here we see Sen developing a notion of freedom connected to identity, which is quite a different notion than his instrumentalist notion of choice of functionings. It's interesting how he broadens out over the course of his lifetime to embrace broader notions. What has this to do with his ideas on economics? I want to link it back for a moment. given his explanation of plural identity, we can understand why Sen described the economic agent as a social human being. No man is an island. We are all related to others according to our multiple identities. This is also a varied group of people. Our economic behavior is determined by these plural identities and our diverse priorities according to these identities. It would only take a rational fool, title of one of his earliest articles, to make the same predictable choice over and over again in relation to a singular identity of being self-interested only. I think you can see why Sen disagrees with rationality as a narrow characteristic of the economic agents. Instead, Sen concludes economic behavior takes richly divergent forms. And this brings me to the fourth theme, without bridge this time. I'm going to talk about his writings on India. The Nobel Prize was not the only prize that Sen was awarded. He also won the Leontiev Prize in Economics, and he was also awarded the Bharat Ratna Prize, which is an Indian civilian award for people who have delivered great service. And many services he did deliver also outside academia. For example, for the United Nations Development Program, for the United Nations Security Council. He also sat on the Sarkozy Commission, and he did many other things. Together with his colleague, Belgian economist Jean Drèze, he wrote a lot on India in several books and a number of articles. The topic of identity reappears in all of these books. For example, the argumentative Indian. If you remember from the beginning of my lecture, this is one of his nicknames, and it's not just a name for fun. It's the title of his 2005 book. And the book is quite a special book compared to the earlier economic writings. It's a book of essays. And in this book, he traces back a number of his favorite themes: multiculturalism, pluralistic debates, secularism, global inclusivity. He traces these themes back to ancient and medieval Indian history and culture, and to figures like Buddha and King Ashok. Together with Jean Drèze, he wrote in 2013 another book on India, An Uncertain Glory. And of course, his most recent book, 2015, The Country of First Boys, is also about India. These more recent books are more about contemporary India and how it is developing, and he also makes recommendations or predictions about its future developments. And in these books he describes how India, despite enjoying quite sustained economic growth rates over the past decades, how many people in Indian society were not able to benefit from that growth. They were really excluded from this growth. And this is due to structural inequalities in India's society. The caste system, for example, but also particularly the gender inequality. So he's writing about these structural inequalities extensively in his Indian book. And he argues that what India needs now, if it wants to develop further, is participatory democracy and public debates to overcome these structural inequalities and really remove the unfreedoms that people are experiencing in India at the moment. Gender inequality, as I said, is a major theme in these books. And girls in some parts of India, as you may know, can be perceived as a financial burden because of their lack of income opportunities and their costly dowries. Over the last 20 years, 500,000 girls have died because of prenatal sex selection and because of infanticide. The term missing women originates from an article that Sen wrote in 1990 for the New York Book Review. Together with a team of demographers, he calculated that worldwide 100 million women are missing. Theoretically, approximately, we have the same number of women and men in the world, maybe a little bit more women because of biological constituency. But the real figures show that 100 million women and girls are actually missing. And this is due to prenatal sex selection, to infanticide, through poor nutrition and healthcare for young girls. There's a concentration of missing women in countries like India, but also in China and in a number of northern African countries. But it's a phenomenon that is spread throughout the world, but this is where it is concentrated the most. I want to move now to my last theme, the fifth theme, human development and social justice. Gradually we see that Sen is broadening out his writings and his ideas to much bigger themes. Human development, social justice, these are huge themes. Along the way, as I was telling earlier, Sen had delivered many services outside academia. For example, he was on the Sarkozy Commission that worked together with Joseph Stiglitz and Jean-Paul Fitoussi. And together they wrote the reports measurement of societal progress. He was also on the founding committee of the Human Development Index with Mahbub ul Haq, a former college friend of his. And the Human Development Index is in a way a follow-up to his capability approach. It is a measure, a composite index measuring people's capabilities in terms of income, education, and healthcare in terms of life expectancy. If people are deprived of good health and education and income, they cannot develop the capabilities they need to achieve a life they value. By the time Sen wrote his book Development as Freedom in 1999, he had come to define development as freedom. And we see here a gradual shift in Sen's thinking towards a broader conceptualization of beyond capability of freedom. And Sen, in this book, started to recognize the importance of structural inequalities that can really limit people's capabilities to begin with. And then the idea of Justice book that was written in 2009. Here, Sen urges for the removal of unfreedoms as necessary preconditions for human development and well-being. He argues that economic growth is merely a means to an end, and it can never be the end in itself. And this is also what stimulated them to write in the Sarkozy report that we shouldn't be so concerned about welfare, but more about well-being. In the idea of justice book, Sen comes full circle with his former teacher John Rawls. He recognizes John Rawls' theory of justice. He really praises it. He's very careful in criticizing it. But he also goes beyond John Rawls' theory of justice in arguing that we need a more constructive approach to advance justice in societies. Not so much by trying to fix the institutions or by designing new rules, but by trying to change people's behavioral norms and rules. The key question of the idea of justice book was not what a perfectly just society looks like, but how to advance justice. And Sen argues for a focus on actual achievements, actual practices that are just or unjust, and a systematic comparison between them. This requires impartial scrutiny, and there he builds on Adam Smith, from close by and from further away. People within our own cultural community should always be critically evaluating social practices, but also people from outside our own cultural group. And here we see the economist and philosopher finally taking a truly integrated approach, recognizing people's plural identities, people's plural value systems should never lead to the deadlock of cultural relativism. I'm right in my culture, you are right in yours. That doesn't bring us social justice. It's very difficult to agree on what is just. It may be easier to agree on what is unjust. And that is how we can advance justice, argues Sen. I've now come to the end of my lecture. I could talk for many hours more about everything that Sen has written. This is just a short selection. I've tried to trace his ideas back to his own plural identity as an economist, a mathematician, a philosopher. I've tried to trace his work back to his early teachers. I've tried to trace his work back to India a little bit. And last but not least, I wish to trace his work back, all of his work back, to an early childhood experience that Sen had at the age of 11, when he lived with his parents in Dhaka. Quite suddenly, it was the 1940s, it was still British India. Quite suddenly, the Hindu-Muslim riots erupted. Whilst before, Muslim and Hindu people were living quite peacefully together, during these riots, Sen experienced his first encounter with murder. And so he tells, I had to observe as a young child some of that mindless violence. One afternoon in Dhaka, a man came through the gate screaming pitifully and bleeding profusely. The wounded person who had been knifed on the back was a Muslim daily laborer called Kader Mia. He had come for some work in a neighboring house for a tiny reward and had been knifed on the street by some communal thugs in our largely Hindu area. As he was being taken to the hospital by my father, he went on saying that his wife had told him not to go into a hostile area during the communal riots. But he had to go out in search of work and earning because his family had nothing to eat. The penalty of that economic unfreedom turned out to be death. which occurred later on in the hospital. The experience was devastating for me and suddenly made me aware of the dangers of narrowly defined identities, and also of the divisiveness that can lie buried in communitarian politics. It also alerted me to the remarkable fact that economic unfreedom, in the form of extreme poverty, can make a person a helpless prey in the violation of other kinds of freedom. Kader Mia need not to have come out to a hostile area in search of income in those troubled times, if his family could have managed without it. I thank you for your attention.